Chapter 1 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein opens with the now narrator Victor Frankenstein's reflecting on the past and telling the story of his parents and his birth. Victor narrates these events in the past tense, and while we learn nothing about what Victor is like during the time that he is recalling these stories, his recollection begins the narrative of his life that follows. First, we learn that Victor is from a distinguished family, and that his father, who for various reasons could not marry until later in life, has lived an honorable life devoted to public service. Victor's father has a truly virtuous character, and when his best friend Beaufort loses his fortune because of bad luck and leaves town to hide his shameful circumstances, he searches for his friend in order to help. Victor's father eventually finds his friend, who has in the meantime fallen ill and is under the care of his daughter Caroline Beaufort. Victor, as the narrator, describes Caroline, whom we later learn is his mother, as intelligent and courageous. Although she was formerly wealthy, she makes no complaints about committing herself to supporting her father through menial labor. Caroline's father eventually dies, and Victor's father takes care of her by sending her into the custody of his relatives in Geneva. 2 years later, he marries Caroline, although she is quite a bit younger than he is. Frankenstein's father adores and protects his young bride, who is strong in her spirit despite her physical weakness, which has resulted from her previous impoverished living conditions. We learn how this couple has a child, and that Victor Frankenstein, our narrator, is the eldest child of the couple. While his mother especially longs to have a daughter, the couple at this time does not have any more children. Then one day, when Frankenstein is about 5 years old, his mother, on one of her charitable missions among the poor in town, adopts a beautiful little girl named Elizabeth Lavenza. Like Frankenstein's mother, Elizabeth is the daughter of an illustrious family who fell into poverty because of unfortunate circumstances. When Elizabeth's father died, she became an orphan, but a poor family takes her into their care. They love the child, but are willing to give her up because they realize she will have a better life with the Frankensteins. Young Victor is thrilled to have a younger sister, and he looks at her as his own. In fact, he feels that she is even more than a sister to him. Victor Frankenstein begins to tell his tale chronologically, starting from the time when his parents first meet. This beginning helps to characterize Victor, and it also gives a model against which to compare Victor himself. We know that both his mother and father are noble and virtuous, so we expect that their son will live up to those expectations as well. Therefore, Victor has a very special genealogy, and this privilege in his breeding is what attracts Robert to his character. Victor's privileged background also functions as a means for comparison between Victor and his mythological prototype Prometheus, upon whom Shelley has modeled her story. Prometheus is one of the Titans, a godlike presence who, in some versions of the story, first creates man, just as Victor will create his monster. The idea of privilege and nobility is important to romantic themes, and within this notion of privilege comes the idea of losing one's good fortune and being reduced to poverty. Both Victor's mother Caroline Beaufort and his adopted sister Elizabeth are well-born women who find themselves living like peasants as a result of unfortunate circumstances. Likewise, later in the story, we will meet the de Lacy family, which shares a similar fate to Victor's mother and sister. Finally, Chapter 1, with its introduction to Victor's mother and sister, sets the tone for the depiction of women throughout the novel. Both of these women find themselves in dire circumstances, only to be later rescued by the fortune of a man, Alphonse Frankenstein. While Caroline and Elizabeth are both virtuous and courageous women, their attributes are more a product of their submissive natures than anything else. The women in Shelley's Frankenstein are often more obedient and loyal than self-sufficient and enterprising. And such depictions are somewhat surprising, considering that Mary Shelley is the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, a pioneering feminist who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Question 1. Which words best describe Victor's parents? Cold and distant, driven and evil, noble and virtuous, dim-witted and slow. Noble and virtuous best describe Victor's parents. Question 2. Which of the following characters was not born into wealth and ended up living in poverty due to unfortunate circumstances? Caroline Beaufort, Victor's adopted sister Elizabeth, the de Lacy family, Robert Walton. Caroline Beaufort, Victor's adopted sister Elizabeth, and the de Lacy family were all born into wealth and ended up living in poverty due to unfortunate circumstances, not Robert Walton. Question 3. Which words best describe the women in Shelley's Frankenstein? Self-serving and enterprising, obedient and loyal, mischievous and evil, thick-headed and shallow. The women in Shelley's Frankenstein are best described as obedient and loyal. In Chapter 2, Victor describes his happy childhood, himself, and those all around him. He mentions his voracious curiosity and eagerness to learn. He contrasts himself with Elizabeth and his best friend Henry Clerval in several ways. For example, he contrasts his love for science, or the causes of the way the world works, with Elizabeth's interest in poetry, or descriptions of how the world works, and Clerval's love of adventure, chivalry, and romance. He describes his temper as violent and passionate, and Elizabeth's as calm and concentrated, Clerval's as noble, humane, and generous. He mentions how he could be sullen in his studies, but that the saintly Elizabeth could subdue him. In the midst of these recollections, Victor acknowledges that presently he is no longer so happy. He acknowledges that his passion for natural science has led him to an ill-fated destiny. He then begins to tell a story about how an incident that occurred when he was 13 led him astray in his quest for knowledge. He recalls how, upon finding a volume of the ancient natural philosopher Cornelius Agrippa, his father half-heartedly dismisses the work without explaining to Victor why Agrippa's science is no longer useful. So, Victor's father's dismissal, rather than discouraging the young teenager from reading the book, only sparks his interest more. Victor describes again his passion for natural science and his eager desire to penetrate the secrets of nature. He then discloses how he dreams to uncover the secrets of death and how to make humans resistant to disease or even bring people back to life. However, despite his enthusiasm for science, he almost gave up his studies entirely when he was 15. He recounts how if he had only given up science for good at that time, he and the world would have been much better off. Victor's temperament clearly contrasts with that of Elizabeth and Clerval. The moderation and virtue of the latter characters highlight the excessiveness and danger of Victor's passions. Victor's infatuation with science, as opposed to Clerval's genial love of poetry, is foreboding. It reflects the romantic's simultaneous fascination with and distrust of science. To understand science is to understand nature, and a passion for science, without an appropriate moral stature, could lead to damaging results. Victor has all the raw material to make appropriate moral decisions regarding his studies. However, his passionate character, which we first witness in this chapter, has the potential to lead him down the unbalanced road of excess. The idea of nothing in excess is a recurring theme in literature and also appears in the myth of Prometheus, upon which Shelley has modeled her story. In the Prometheus story, the Titan Prometheus transgresses laws of propriety by tricking Zeus into choosing a sacrifice that looks sumptuous on the outside but contains nothing but bones on the inside. Prometheus's hubristic action is an example of his using his intelligence and his cleverness for an ill purpose. Zeus punishes Prometheus for this and binds the Titan to a rock in Hades, where an eagle will continually gnaw at his liver, which perpetually renews itself. At the same time, the theme of excess bears special relevance to many contemporary debates about science as well. For example, the creation and use of nuclear energy, human cloning, and stem cell research. The character of Victor Frankenstein encourages us to consider the moral consequences of many decisions involving science. On the one hand, humans have a responsibility to use our intelligence and create new things. But at the same time, many scientists in particular have often regretted the uses for which their inventions have been used. Without providing any right or wrong answers to the profound questions that it raises, Shelley's Frankenstein is a classic because it continues to encourage us to contemplate such questions nearly 200 years after it's been written. Question 1. Which character does Victor describe as noble, humane, and generous? Himself, Henry Clerval, Elizabeth, Prometheus. Victor describes the character of Henry Clerval as noble, humane, and generous. Question 2. Victor's infatuation with science, as opposed to Clerval's love of poetry, is foreboding. It reflects the Romantics' simultaneous fascination with and distrust of nature, women, science, government. Victor's infatuation with science, as opposed to Clerval's love of poetry, is foreboding. It reflects the Romantics' simultaneous fascination with and distrust of science. Question 3. Which of the following is a recurring theme that appears in both the myth of Prometheus and Frankenstein? Nothing in excess, treasure companionship, wealth is evil, death is inevitable. Nothing in excess is a recurring theme that appears in both the myth of Prometheus and Frankenstein. Chapter 3 begins as Victor recalls the events surrounding his departure to the University of Ingolstadt when he is just 17. As he is about to leave for school, his beloved Elizabeth falls ill with scarlet fever. Elizabeth recovers from her illness, but their mother Caroline, who was Elizabeth's nurse, catches the fever and dies. On her deathbed, their mother expresses her dying wish that Elizabeth and Victor will one day marry. Like her adoptive mother, Elizabeth is virtuous and strong in her spirit. Through our narrator's eyes, we learn how she endures her loss with grace. She continues to perform her household duties, and she puts the needs of others before herself, always making sure to take care of their extended family of uncles and cousins. In the midst of his bereavement, Victor must depart for school alone. Although his friend Clerval has wanted to study at the university as well, his father would not allow it. So Victor leaves on his own, realizing that even though he has always longed to leave home, he is now very sad to go. Once at university, Victor blames chance, or the evil influence, the angel of destruction, for leading him to M. Krempe, a professor of natural philosophy. Victor takes an instant dislike to M. Krempe, who has told Victor that he has wasted his time reading useless books. But M. Krempe does direct him to the lecture of M. Waldman, and M. Waldman is quite the opposite of M. Krempe, making a strong impression on Victor. Victor is enthused by the professor's lecture and has a renewed interest in science and desires once again to discover the mysteries of nature. He marks this day, upon which he first meets his mentor M. Waldman, as the moment that decides his future destiny. Ancient Greek literature and culture has had a profound influence on the imagination of the Romantics, and we again see this influence in Frankenstein with Victor's reference to the evil influence, angel of destruction, that leads him to M. Krempe, professor of natural philosophy at the university. Victor has previously referred to the role of fate in his decisions as well. For example, in Chapter 2, he says how he chanced to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa that inspired his love of natural philosophy. He also states, foreshadowing his future demise, how destiny has mapped his life's course for him. Destiny was too potent, and her immutable laws had decreed my utter and terrible destruction. With the mechanisms of fate at work, and without his friends to balance and guide him, Victor takes another step toward his future demise by beginning a more ardent study of natural philosophy. In this case, the mention that Henry Clerval is unable to attend university due to his father's wishes can serve two purposes. On the one hand, it serves a function of plot, because we see how, without Henry's stabilizing influence, Victor becomes obsessive about his studies. At the same time, Henry's inability to go to Ingolstadt demonstrates the class division between Victor and Henry. Henry's father is a merchant who must work for his money, and he is skeptical and suspicious of the merits of an aristocratic education in arts and letters. Henry's fine character throughout the novel, however, demonstrates how cultivation in languages and poetry produces a moral and refined disposition. It is Henry who always guides and calms the nervous Victor, just as moral thinking and legislation, as in the case of human cloning, is often needed to impose limitations on the advances of science. Question 1. What is Caroline Frankenstein's dying wish? That Victor study to become a great scientist, that one day Victor and Elizabeth will marry, that her body be used for scientific research, that her husband never marry another. Caroline Frankenstein's dying wish is that one day Victor and Elizabeth will marry. Question 2. Once at the university, Victor blames chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, for leading him to which professor? M. Waldman, M. Krempe, C. Agrippa, H. Clerval. Once at the university, Victor blames chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, for leading him to M. Krempe. Question 3. Which of the following is not a result of Henry Clerval being unable to attend the university due to his father's wishes? Victor begins a more ardent study of natural philosophy. Victor becomes obsessive about his studies. It demonstrates the class division between Victor and Henry. Victor is introduced to M. Waldman. Henry's inability to attend the university with Victor results in Frankenstein beginning a more ardent study of natural philosophy. It also allows Victor to become more obsessive about his studies and demonstrates the class division between Victor and Henry. It does not result in Victor's introduction to M. Waldman. Here we learn of Victor's plan to create a human being. The chapter begins with Victor's describing his dedication to his studies. He remembers how he would study all night long and how quickly he made progress in his courses. In these recollections, he recalls how his academic interests led him to his desire of creating a human. For example, he tells us how the human frame, physiology, and anatomy had attracted his attention. He also mentions how from his childhood he never had any fear of death, superstitions, or the macabre. Victor then abruptly leaps out of the narrative to address his listener, Robert Walton, directly. He warns Robert, and indirectly the reader as well, to recognize the dangers of making discoveries. He advises moderation as opposed to hubris in all pursuits of knowledge. Having warned his friend, he then discloses how he decided to create a human being, and how he believed that in the process he would discover how to bring people back to life from death. At the close of the chapter, we learn that Victor has become obsessed with his idea. His mental and physical health is not good. He lives in a constant state of anxiety, and he has slow fevers at night. He has isolated himself in his work and forgotten about his friends and family. In retrospect, he again harks back to the importance of moderation when he iterates, "A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never to allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquility." When Victor disrupts his narration to address Robert Walton and us readers directly, he does so to advise his friend to follow moderation in all his pursuits and to be humble as opposed to lofty and arrogant. "Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow." Although the theme of moderation dominates this chapter, we also see here a vivid illustration of the macabre, which helps to classify Shelley's Frankenstein as Gothic fiction. We learn how Victor has no qualms about handling dead bodies. He has never had a fear of death or superstitions. He is willing to explore the darker side of nature, which adds to the novel's element of mystery. Victor pursues the study of natural philosophy not to unravel the bright joys of living, but to explore the darker, more mysterious nature of human existence. So within the recesses of Victor's imagination, we find a vision of the Gothic, which still resonates today, not only in styles of fiction, but also in a genre of modern pop music as well, characterized by melancholic melodies and lonesome lyrics. Question 1. During Chapter 4, Victor leaps out of his description of his studies to pose what warning to Robert Walton? He advises moderation in all pursuits of knowledge. He begs him to never confront his creation. He asks him to, should he eventually die, burn his journals. To never fall in love. During Chapter 4, Victor leaps out of his description of his studies to advise Robert that moderation should be practiced in all pursuits of knowledge. Question 2. Why does Victor decide to create a human being? Because of an oath he made to his father, because he is horribly lonely without his dear friend Clerval, because he hopes to discover how to bring people back to life from death, because he sees it as a natural progression for mankind. Victor decides to create a human being because he hopes to discover how to bring people back to life from death. Question 3. Although the theme of moderation dominates this chapter, we also see here a vivid illustration of the macabre, which helps to classify Shelley's Frankenstein as science fiction, Gothic fiction, classic myth, folklore. Although the theme of moderation dominates this chapter, we also see here a vivid illustration of the macabre, which helps to classify Shelley's Frankenstein as Gothic fiction. After 2 years of labor, the monster is finally born. Upon its conception, Victor, in an emotional state, falls asleep and dreams of Elizabeth's becoming a corpse. He wakes up horrified. He is not only horrified, but also disappointed that so many years of hard work have commenced with such a wretched creation. All that he has longed for was nothing. In his misery and confusion, Victor Frankenstein roams through the bleak, wet morning streets of Ingolstadt, quoting Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner as he goes. Upon his wanderings, however, he happens to see his old friend Henry Clerval. Clerval tells him about Elizabeth and his father, and also about how his own father has finally allowed him to study at university. For the first time in ages, Frankenstein feels comfort and relief. When he invites Clerval back to his home, though, he worries that the monster will reveal itself to his friend. But the monster has fled, so Victor and Henry continue to talk there. Clerval again remarks about how ill Victor looks, Victor finally has a nervous breakdown and depends on his friend for support. For one winter, Henry nurses Victor back to health, and upon Victor's recovery, he asks his ill friend to write to his family, and also shows him a letter from Elizabeth, his adopted sister, who is referred to as his cousin. The excerpt from Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which Shelley introduces at the peak of the chapter, symbolizes the haunting presence of the dark recesses of nature and the human imagination. Victor is like the one who, on a lonely road, doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round, walks on, and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Victor has walked the lonely road during his creation of the monster. He has turned round and seen the horror of his creation, and instead of confronting this demon, he turns no more his head. He runs from the frightful fiend who doth close behind him tread. This running away demonstrates Victor's irresponsibility, because despite the strength of his education and heritage, he does not possess the character to handle the consequences of his actions responsibly. Victor cannot be blamed for embarking upon the lonely road of research. He cannot be blamed for courageously pursuing his ideas and passions for science. However, he can be blamed for failing to deal with the repercussions of his actions. Victor has shown disrespect not in his creation, but in his failure to think through the consequences that his actions will have on the natural world. Question 1. After 2 years of labor, the monster is finally born. How does Victor react? He celebrates with his fellow students. He collapses in sheer exhaustion. Horrified, he flees into the streets of Ingolstadt by immediately beginning a study of the creature's behavior. Victor reacts to the birth of his creature by fleeing into the streets of Ingolstadt, horrified. Question 2. What poem does Victor quote as he roams the wet morning streets of Ingolstadt? Homer's Odyssey, Keats' Ode to a Nightingale, Poe's The Raven, Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Victor quotes Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner as he wanders the wet morning streets of Ingolstadt. Question 3. Which of the following is not an example of the Gothic elements shown in Chapter 5? The stormy weather, the gruesome birth of the monster, the sudden appearance of Henry Clerval, the reference to Samuel Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. The stormy weather, the gruesome birth of the monster, and reference to Samuel Coleridge's Gothic-style poem Rime of the Ancient Mariner are all examples of Chapter 5's Gothic elements, not Henry Clerval's sudden appearance.